Hello, I'm Pamela Hart. I'm the Executive Director and Assistant Dean for the Center for Animal Law Studies here at Lewis and Clark Law School. And it's hard to believe that it's been 2 years since we launched the Global Law Alliance for Animals in the Environment. And I'm pleased to say that joining me today is the Global Law Alliance team, Clinical Professor Erica Lyman, who is GLA's director, and Nick Fromhurst, who is GLA's Latin American Program Director and Adjunct Professor. For those of you that don't know, GLA is a collaboration between the Center for Animal Law Studies and our nationally recognized environmental law program here at the law school. Through GLA, Professors Lyman and Fromhurst are doing incredible work training our students and protecting wild animals and wild spaces across the globe. And as we celebrate the second anniversary, I'm excited to talk with Erica and Nick about GLA's work over the past year, and also to discuss what's ahead and what is in store as we look forward to the next academic year. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and welcome Erica and Nick. So for those of you joining us who may not already be familiar with GLA, can one of you please share with us how GLA works to protect wild animals and the environment?
Pam, it's so exciting that we're 2 years old. I'm really pleased about that and excited to be here to talk to people, to share our great work. To your question, about how does GLA protect wild animals and wild spaces, or wild animals in the environment? We do that by focusing on international law. We interpret that broadly in our clinic space and in our practices. So for us, for Nick and I and our students, that means that we work both in international fora, so treaty spaces typically, as well as in foreign jurisdictions. So it might be domestic law in foreign jurisdictions. The way that we sort of bridge the maybe like what sometimes seems like a crevasse between animal law and environmental law, where sometimes those sort of academic areas are in tension or at loggerheads, we sort of look at it like in the international space, environmental law has a longer history, and there are existing laws, particularly treaties that sort of pertain to or apply to wild animals and habitat spaces. And so we look at our job as bridging that divide by using those tools to the extent that they are available to us for the protection of wild animals and wild spaces, as you say. That is kind of the bridge that we bring to it. All of the work that Nick and I do in our practice is with, or most of the work is side by side, hand in hand with students. And in terms of Nick and I being lawyers out there in the world, in GLA, functioning as an organization, as an advocacy organization in the world, the thing that makes us unique is that students are there at every part of the journey. So from strategizing about what issues to take up to completing, filing documents, working on media, all of it. And that's really exciting for us. Maybe Nick has something to add there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would co-sign all of that, and just to sort of add one more point to the student experience that we try to cultivate. As Erica said, students are involved in the sort of germination process, and so what we'll do usually to kick off a semester is we have a sort of docket, some things that we absolutely have to work on and we know we're going to work on, but we usually try to create a space where we can solicit, and we do that actively, student interest areas. And then once we know, okay, this student, for instance, is really interested in sharks, we'll look for a way to try to meet that, essentially. And it's kind of a nice creative combination of meeting student interests with also, as Erica says, what's feasible given the legal tools that exist or that we can advocate for. So we do try to involve students, I think, in that inception work as well.
That's
Can I just-
wonderful. And thank you both. And I love hearing about the student involvement. And I'd like to build on that in a little bit when we get into more specifics about the type of work that you're focusing on. But before we get there, can we talk about the broader picture for wild animals around the world? And specifically, I think people would be curious to learn more about what their biggest threats are that face them, along with what are the greatest challenges to protecting these wild animals across the globe.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, and this is one of this question sort of triggers for me, or harkens back to this idea of sitting in between or within both the animal law program and the environmental law program at Lewis and Clark, because when we're talking about wild animals, I think, to be honest with ourselves, we need to talk about climate change, and we need to talk about habitat degradation and destruction. At the end of the day, those are the two major drivers of wild animal losses around the world right now, unless we're talking about fisheries issues. And I'll pass to Nick in just a second to talk more about that. But we try to do work like, we do climate change work. We might get involved in fighting an oil and gas project. And well, some folks might say, oh, that's environmental law. From our perspective, it's also animal law because of the broader existential threats that climate change poses to animals, but also because of the link with, land use choices, and the fact that a lot of these new development projects are happening either in or adjacent to protected areas, and some of the sort of wild, free ranging spaces we have for wild animals right now. And with that, I am going to pass to Nick to talk about fisheries. And in a little bit of reality, I'm going to quick grab my computer charger.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, and I think that's is a great segue to talk a little bit about fisheries and some related issues. So, as Erica mentioned, the latest science on threats to wild animals, and we definitely include fish and other aquatic species in that. The biggest threats for terrestrial animals are habitat degradation and change, as Erica says. Now, that's not to diminish the very real compounding threat or just phenomenon, which is poaching and trade of wild terrestrial animals for poaching. These threats don't exist in a vacuum. They add to and aggravate one another, and so that is also a big problem for wild terrestrial fauna. For marine species, for marine animals, the biggest threat actually is not habitat degradation. That's a real problem. It is a threat, but the biggest one is direct extraction. So here we're talking about fishing activity primarily. We're talking both about intentional targeted capture of different marine animals, primarily fish, but we're also talking about bycatch, what's called bycatch or incidental capture. So somebody perhaps is fishing for a tuna species and they capture dolphins along the way, and that's collateral damage and very serious. So in the fisheries space, in how humans interact with wild marine animals, food systems, the way people source around the globe protein is a real problem. And just to add one more important dimension, and then I'll kick it back to Erica. we do need to talk about here both lawful activity that's irresponsible, and probably out of scale. There's some real problems within what is, legally permitted. I think that's fair to say. There's also, of course, what's known as illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing, which is added right on top of what's already pretty problematic legal fishing practices. And so we try to work there on both fronts, really.
Thank you for that, Nick. And Erica, do you have anything to add to that as we just build out the framework of what are the greatest challenges and threats for wildlife? And if not, I'm happy to drill down and ask a few more questions.
Well, I mean, if I could just add on a little bit, I suppose, and maybe, it's a little bit repetitive, but I think it bears saying again that, because we're lawyers using legal tools, right? I think we have to be honest with ourselves that the legal system we're currently operating in, the tools that are available to us, they don't do what we want them to do, right? And so if I could just add this sort of like legal challenge that, in particular, fish and marine mammals face, like this idea that we can have legal fishing up to a certain point. Maybe we're concerned about bycatch, maybe we're concerned about, illegal fishing, right? I'm talking about the existing legal system. That's problematic in and of itself, right? And the same is true, for even wildlife treaties that, I think that I love more, like CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or the Convention on Migratory Species. And so to me, I think that one systemic challenge that wild animals face is just this built-in way in which they're perceived in both international law and domestic law. And we didn't talk about this in response to your first question, but certainly one of the things that we work on, and it takes a lot of sort of creative thinking and creative work and very specific factual scenarios in order to be productive on this area, but is transformative change for animals in the law. So how do we exploit the system that we have, right, for the benefit of wild animals, but how do we start moving toward a legal system that does more of what we want it to do, both for, broadly speaking, animals and the environment? I think most activists on the environmental side are going to agree that systemic legal change is necessary, or transformative legal change, as we tend to say in our spaces.
I love that, Erica, and I think that's so important to consider as we talk about the broader framework of the challenges and the threats to wild animals, that we're working in this system that isn't ideal. So with that, I'd like to transition, recognizing and acknowledging those transitions. Could you share with us the type of work that the Global Law Alliance has been engaged in over the past year, and share the opportunities, the challenges, what's been effective, what hasn't been effective, given the parameters that we've talked about so far?
That's a great question. I think the first thing we're going to do is a little GLA self-promotion, and I'm going to pass it to Nick, because over the course of the last 2 years, we've decided to put a lot of effort into growing our Latin America program, and Nick is at the helm of that and can talk about what we've done there.
Yeah, it's been a real honor and a privilege to work specifically in this way, and in this area. I have the joy and pleasure of living and working primarily from my home office in Bolivia, and so we've really kind of taken advantage of that in an intentional way, to try to build out and begin to build out, with student efforts for sure, a Latin America program. The program contains a lot of work, and so maybe I'll just mention a couple of examples. We've developed a relationship with many different governmental and non-governmental actors in several countries. Perhaps the most poignant example would be with Peru. So we've done a lot of work with Peru, made several trips there to engage in training of best practices for fighting wildlife crime with Peruvian prosecutors, judges, and other enforcement personnel. So including, for instance, protected area rangers. And the work there, again, to go back to this sort of theme of, we have to, in some ways, work with the tools that are available, but at the same time, we can push for systemic and profound change to add new tools. So our work, when we train judges and prosecutors in these workshops, and when we put together handbooks or practical kind of field manuals, is to do just that. Point out the ways that, the tools that exist, we don't necessarily need a new law, or we can't necessarily count on having a new law in the short term. So, but here are creative ways that the laws that exist can be put into practice to try to react to what is in the Latin American region a pretty serious problem with wildlife crime. And I should also say that, subject matter wise and programmatically, that work we've been doing, thanks in large measure to Erica in other parts of the world for quite a long time. So Erica's done a lot to sort of develop this kind of work in the African continent. And so we're doing, we're really kind of expanding that regionally in Latin America. And it's just been great. And I think, again, we're just really looking forward to continuing the, not growth for growth's sake, but making a real difference, we think, and getting students involved. And it's been exciting.
Thank you for that, Nick. Erica, would you like to add any examples of the type of work that you've been focused on this past year?
Yeah, sure. And one thing, so as Nick is mentioning, we have historically worked a lot on sort of combating wildlife crime or combating wildlife trafficking issues. Our work largely started with a project that we did in Malawi, and we still work regularly with our partners in Malawi, both government agencies and NGOs, the Long Way Wildlife Trust in particular in Malawi. And that's expanded to, West Africa. We work in several countries. Nick and I are just back from Ghana, in fact, where we did a Train the Trainers program. So this is really exciting, right? Like, we're not walking into countries and saying like, hey, you should do XYZ because we say so. We try to go to countries with, a baseline of knowledge about their laws, how it, and how things work in their country. And then we run these Train the Trainer programs where judges and prosecutors are chosen as leaders in the fight against wildlife crime. And we work with them to build a curriculum that they can use to train additional judges and prosecutors in their home countries, which I just find really fun to do that kind of work. And then when we bring students into the mix, right, it allows us to teach all sorts of really important cultural competency lessons, to look at, we talk a lot about our biases and issues that we are navigating here in the US. And when we bring it to the international stage, it's the same, right? But like a different context. And I think it's really important for students who want to work in the international animal and or environmental space to have the kind of exposure that allows them to fully realize what their biases might be, to actually engage in that cultural competency learning, and to be able to engage and support organizations from around the world whose work overlaps with theirs. So I think that's really important. And that's just a kind of really an added benefit, frankly, for the students from that kind of work. So we have this Latin America program. We also do a lot of combating wildlife trafficking work in Africa. We do all sorts of other things. And because I've done this before to Pam, you know that I could probably talk forever about the work that GLA is doing, but maybe just a few highlights. So one, great issue that we've been involved in lately that folks might know about because National Geographic has written or has published a series of articles on this issue is oil and gas drilling in the Okavango region or the Kavango region of Namibia, and then the Okavango Delta region of Botswana. We've done a lot of work to support local partner organizations who are fighting those projects. The siting of those projects is, broadly speaking, in one of the or in like the largest sort of stronghold of free roaming elephants. And so it's a really important elephant habitat area. There's many indigenous people and local communities who live and use the area. So there's human rights issues, it's oil and gas, there's climate change issues. There are forestry issues because you're building new roads. There's commensurate illegal trade in African hardwood species. So it's kind of it's sort of everything at once. Animal related issues, environmental issues, human related issues, all of the things. And so we've been able to, sort of look at the problem from a really wide angle lens perspective, right? Which is, okay, if we do international law, we define that as treaties, we define that as foreign law, we do animal law, we do environmental law. Let's just keep coming at this problem every which way, to see what impact we can possibly have. One of the interesting things that we've done, and it sort of, I think, is emblematic of the creativity that we bring to the table when we work with students who have all sorts of past experiences as well, is we filed a securities complaint against the company that was working in the region. It was in partnership with other organizations, but we alleged that there were misrepresentations of the company's potential value, what they were looking for, and the consequences that the project would have on the environment and local peoples in the area. And that's, an investigation that we hope, results in the rule of law being applied to that particular company. I think that's one example of creative work we've done. We've also done some really interesting and I think rewarding student work around sort of international treaty negotiations. So we're currently preparing for the meeting, an upcoming meeting of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So we've spent the last year preparing, helping our, government friends, NGO friends, prepare documents, think through issues. Students are involved intimately in all of that. The awesome thing is now they get to see governments voting on those issues and negotiating those issues at an international meeting. Similarly, with some work we've done in the Convention of Migratory Species. So we're all over the place, and it's opportunistic, I suppose, in some ways, but the fact that we function as a clinic and that it's Nick and I, we get to be nimble and really try to put our best foot forward where we think there's a need for our support and our legal skills.
That's really wonderful. Thank you for elaborating on that. And I think both of you at the beginning of this conversation stressed the importance of student involvement and how students have such a unique opportunity to get involved in this hands-on type of work. And for those of you out there who are watching who don't know, our mission here at the Center for Animal Law Studies is to train the next generation to become effective advocates for animals and the environment. And with that, are there any other examples of the type of work that the students are specifically involved in from beginning to end, or real hands-on experiences that you'd like to before we move on?
Sure, I'll start, and then I'll pass to Nick. So just following on this sort of oil and gas project work, right? I think this is a great example where, in fact, our colleague Joyce Tischler read an article about an oil and gas project, a National Geographic article, and she sent it to a couple of us at CALS, and kind of made the point like, what are we going to do about this? This is crazy. And I forwarded it to some clinic students, and we sort of formed a little student pod. We break students up to work on different projects, and we didn't know what we were going to do, right? It wasn't like I knew the answers. It wasn't like we knew what the legal tools were even available to us. And so students, I think Nick mentioned the sort of from the germination of a project to the conclusion of a project, students are involved, and their students are involved in, global coalition calls, strategic partnership calls, all with organizations they want to work with in the future. So that's one of the major benefits, of being a clinic student. They did the drafting, they helped supported media, they're helping put together quotes, they're helping think through like, what are the defamation issues we need to be concerned about? So it's like sort of the broader picture of what it takes to be an effective animal and or environmental advocate. And we really try to put students at the front and center of everything. We also, I mentioned our Convention on Migratory Species work. So some of that involved drafting a model law, doing some national legislative assessments, and then doing a handful of legal analyses around some of the deep, dark corners of the treaty and trying to figure out like what is the best way to interpret these provisions? How do they harmonize? New issues are coming up because, for example, birds are migrating in two different countries in different patterns as a result of climate change. So how does the treaty evolve to deal with that? Students did, all of that work. And so the awesome part there is they're going to see their work on the CMS agenda embedded in documents that are filed for governments to negotiate and think through and adopt, right? So that's really putting your finger in the mix of international law and policy in ways that frankly I don't think students get at other schools.
I tend to agree with you. And I just want to add how fortunate we are to have these students from all around the world studying with us here at Lewis and Clark Law School, but how fortunate for them that they get to take this clinic and participate and learn from you two experts. I wish I could enroll in the clinic. Maybe someday I'll do that.
Well, we're gonna do something together, Pam.
Yeah, okay, that'd be
we
fantastic.
learn as much from those students as they learn from us. I am 100% positive about that. And even our US-based students, right? Like the experiences that students have before they come to law school, before they're getting their LLM, it's all relevant. It's all important, and it all makes you like a unique advocate with the opportunity to be creative in terms of legal solutions.
Right. And I love that. And I think as we're wrapping up this conversation, I'd like to shift my last question to each of you. When you reflect and look back on this past year, can each of you share one accomplishment that you're most proud of? And sky's the limit here.
Go ahead, Nick.
No. So trying to narrow it down to one is tough, of course, but I think I would point to something that is kind of a blockbuster legal change that we've seen in Peru. So I want to go back to Peru on this one. So starting a few years ago, there were conversations within NGO circles, local Peruvian NGO circles, and a few motivated Congress people about the need to treat wildlife crime, so poaching and trafficking of wildlife animals, wild animals, as a form of organized crime, or at least potentially as a form of organized crime. And legally, why that's important is because in the Peruvian system, certain powerful investigative tools, like the use of undercover agents, like being able to do wiretaps, like being able to access bank records, are very difficult to unlock unless the crime being investigated is classified as a form of organized crime. And so there's a law in Peru, as in many countries, there's a law on organized crime. The law against organized crime is called. And for many, many years, and we see this in many countries, the scope of kind of the substantive crimes that are treated as organized crime is fairly limited to the classic stuff, we see on Netflix binge shows, right? Drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms trafficking, maybe money laundering, and some financial crimes. But trafficking of wild animals was not included. And that meant, well, you can't use those very powerful investigative tools, and you also can't get the additional penalties that pertain to organized crime. Long story short, we got involved, and I want to be honest about this. Lots of people were involved, and in some ways that makes it all the better, really. We were working in coalition and in partnership, and really just tried to contribute to the push to get this change. And so a bill was introduced. Something we wrote was actually cited in the bill, which was kind of cool to see. And just a couple of months ago, it finally made it through Congress and was signed to the president. So now, signed by the president. So now wildlife trafficking and other associated crimes, so like poaching in the first place, of wild animals, is eligible to be treated as a form of organized crime. And again, I think it's really important to, give credit to all the other important actors that were involved. We like to think we contributed to the effort, but seeing this outcome in a pretty concrete way, and in a country where we've invested a lot of time in other ways as well. And so seeing kind of how relationships and careful study of national context and opportunities can ultimately, bear fruit in this way was pretty cool to see.
Thank you for sharing that, Nick. That's an incredible accomplishment. So congratulations to you and everyone who was involved. And with that, Erica, is there anything that you would like to share, one particular accomplishment that stood out for you this past year?
Well, I have a hard time stopping at one. But I will say a couple of things. So, we, just to go back to sort of, being cited, a blog that Nick and I wrote with a colleague, Hugo Echeverria, was actually cited in a legal opinion in Ecuador that recognized that wild animals are rights holders under rights of nature frameworks. So that's incredible, right? The fact that the reasoning that we put forward in a blog was incorporated into this legal decision that, if bears fruit as precedent, legal precedent in Ecuador, should really do great things for wild animals. I think that's something to be hugely proud of. following on that, we had the benefit or the honor, I suppose, of hosting a colleague, Dr. Tanya Wyatt at Lewis and Clark, who, and we had a small workshop thinking about rights of nature. How are wild animals treated in domestic legal systems? With the idea being that how we define what it means to be a wild animal often shapes the legal protections in a domestic system. This harkens back to like what Nick is talking about too, right? It's creating these linkages because sometimes our definitions are too narrow and they don't match the reality on the ground. We were able to work on that issue with Dr. Wyatt and with some of our incredible LLM students who were able to take everything we'd learned the spring semester of the last academic year about rights of nature, all the work we've done to develop theories, to look at the application of the principles and the legal framework of rights of nature in their individual countries. And they were able to do presentations for Dr. Wyatt that are now incorporated in a short documentary and will be used as insights into some academic pieces that Tanya, Dr. Wyatt is working on. So I just think that's great, right? When you get the mama bird feelings with your students and they've learned something and then they're going out in the world and presenting what they've learned, presenting their own perspectives and really shining in their own light. I think that is, I feel so proud of that. So, that's one thing. And just if I can indulge here a little bit, like along the same lines, I mentioned that there's an upcoming meeting of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species meeting coming up in November, where hopefully we're able to do many good things for many wild animals. There are going to be so many Lewis and Clark alums at the meeting representing and working for the protection of wild animals, representing all sorts of organizations from all around the world. And I just think that's incredible. I'm so proud of our clinic, of CALS, of the environmental law program, and of Lewis and Clark for giving us the opportunity to be able to do that for students and really shaping careers the way that we get to.
I think that is a wonderful way to end our conversation today, really talking about how things can go full circle here at Lewis and Clark Law School with our LLM students. Now, as you said, you're going to be working with them as professionals at these meetings. And it's just been such an honor and a joy to hear about your accomplishments and all the work that you two have been focusing on this past year. So I'd like to thank you both for joining me today and everybody else who is listening to this. Congratulations on your 2-year anniversary. And we can't wait to see what you do in years 3, 4, 5, 6, and beyond. So thank you both, and everybody else have a wonderful day.